The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial and painful chapters in modern American history. Fought for nearly 2 decades, it cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans, millions of Vietnamese, and left scars that still linger across both nations. Officially, the U.S. entered the war to stop the spread of communism. But beneath that narrative lies a deeper, more complex reality, one that exposes how ignorance of history, cultural arrogance, and Cold War paranoia led to a war that could never be won. This was not just a military failure. It was a failure of understanding. American leaders saw Vietnam as a pawn in a global chess game, not as a people fighting for independence. From the moment the U.S. stepped in to replace the Hoppo French colonial power, it misunderstood the enemy, misjudged its allies, and misled its own citizens. The war was not lost in the jungles. It was lost before the first shot was fired, in the halls of power where flawed assumptions guided disastrous decisions. This is the real story of why Vietnam was doomed from the start. The roots of the Vietnam War reach far deeper than most realize, back into the era of empires. In the mid-1800s, France colonized Vietnam, folding it into its larger imperial creation, French Indochina. French colonial rule was not merely administrative, it was exploitative. The French seized fertile lands, forced peasants into rubber plantations, imposed heavy taxes, and prioritized French economic interests over native well-being. Vietnamese culture and identity were marginalized, and the language of the colonizers became the key to advancement. The local population was reduced to second-class citizens in their own land. Resistance simmered, but it wasn't until the early 20th century that a cohesive nationalist movement began to emerge, one that blended traditional patriotism with radical new ideas from abroad. At the heart of this was Nguyen Sinh Cung, better known by his revolutionary name, Ho Chi Minh. Ho was no ordinary rebel. He was an intellectual and a traveler who had lived in France, the U.S., the Soviet Union, and China. He absorbed global ideologies and reimagined them for Vietnam's context. To Ho and his followers, communism was not a foreign imposition. It was a tool for liberation, an anti-colonial framework that could unite peasants and workers against imperialist oppression. After Japan's occupation of Vietnam during World War II, Ho's communist-led Viet Minh guerrillas fought both Japanese forces and eventually the returning French. In 1945, sensing an opportunity in the post-war upheaval, Ho declared Vietnam's independence, invoking the very words of Thomas Jefferson. "All men are created equal," he proclaimed. He hoped the U.S., having just defeated fascism and Japanese imperialism, would recognize Vietnam's right to self-determination, but the U.S. turned away. Instead of supporting the Vietnamese nationalists, America chose to support France's reassertion of control, partly to keep France aligned in NATO, and partly because of growing fears of communist expansion. The betrayal of Vietnamese independence aspirations led directly to the First Indochina War, 1946-1954. It was a war of attrition and ideology. The Viet Minh, armed with conviction and Soviet Chinese aid, used guerrilla tactics to wear down French forces. The French, though better armed, were unfamiliar with the jungle terrain and lacked public support both at home and among the Vietnamese people. The war reached its brutal crescendo at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. French forces had fortified a valley, believing they had a superior tactical position. But the Viet Minh, defying expectations, hauled artillery through dense jungle and high mountains, encircling the French. After a 57-day siege, France surrendered, marking the first time a Western colonial power had been defeated by an Asian nationalist movement. It was a historic humiliation, and France withdrew in disgrace. At the Geneva Conference later that year, Vietnam was temporarily divided into 2 zones, North Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam, under an anti-communist regime backed by the West. Crucially, national elections were scheduled for 1956 to reunify the country. But before those elections could be held, the U.S. intervened, derailing what could have been a peaceful political resolution. By the early 1950s, U.S. foreign policy was no longer just about diplomacy. It was about defending ideology. The Cold War had hardened. The Soviet Union had developed nuclear weapons. China had fallen to communism in 1949. Then came the Korean War in 1950, where U.S. troops fought against North Korean and Chinese communist forces. To American leaders, Southeast Asia looked like the next flashpoint. President Dwight D. Eisenhower articulated what would become the dominant U.S. justification for entering Vietnam, the domino theory. If one country in Asia fell to communism, it was argued, neighboring countries would topple like falling dominoes. The loss of Vietnam, they claimed, could lead to the fall of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and even India. Communism, in their eyes, wasn't just a political system, it was a virus. But this theory overlooked something essential. Vietnamese communism was born of nationalism. Ho Chi Minh's primary goal wasn't to spread global revolution, it was to free Vietnam from foreign domination. His alliance with communism was strategic. It offered organizational discipline, support from China and the USSR, and a framework for class-based mobilization. What American policymakers failed to see was that the real battle in Vietnam was not between capitalism and communism, but between colonizers and the colonized. Still, the U.S. decided it had to prevent a red Vietnam. When France withdrew, the U.S. quickly filled the vacuum. American money, weapons, and advisors flooded into South Vietnam, and with CIA backing, Ngo Dinh Diem was installed as president in 1955. Diem was a Western-educated Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. He was virulently anti-communist and deeply authoritarian. The U.S. saw him as a modernizer. But most Vietnamese saw him as a foreign puppet, disconnected from their daily realities. The key turning point came when Diem refused to participate in the 1956 reunification elections. The reason? He would have lost, badly. Ho Chi Minh was far more popular, even in the South. The United States supported Diem's refusal, thereby violating the Geneva Accords. In doing so, America destroyed any credibility it might have had as a neutral player. From this moment on, the war was no longer about defending democracy. It was about propping up an illegitimate regime to serve Cold War interests. The consequences were devastating. Diem's regime became increasingly brutal. He cracked down on Buddhists, exiled political opponents, and enriched a narrow Catholic elite while peasants starved. In response, thousands of Vietnamese joined a growing resistance in the South, the Viet Cong, or National Liberation Front. These were not foreign invaders, they were Southern Vietnamese fighting against their own government, fueled by rage, idealism, and years of repression. As America deepened its support for Diem, it also deepened its own trap. The U.S. was no longer defending liberty, it was defending failure, and the people of Vietnam, North and South, saw it. After the Geneva Accords, the United States placed its hopes for a non-communist Vietnam in Ngo Dinh Diem, the newly installed leader of South Vietnam. But Diem's regime was built not on popular support, but on American funding, military protection, and a fragile illusion of order. Though Washington painted him as a strong anti-communist bulwark, the truth was more complex and troubling. Diem was a French-educated Catholic Mandarin ruling over a largely Buddhist agrarian population. He surrounded himself with loyalists, mostly family members and members of the Catholic elite, who were widely resented by the peasantry. While Diem spoke the language of freedom and anti-communism, he ruled like an autocrat, imprisoning opponents, banning political parties, censoring the press, and torturing suspected communists or dissidents. Villages were uprooted and forced into strategic hamlets, fortified camps designed to isolate the population from the Viet Cong insurgency. But these programs often backfired, alienating rural people who already distrusted the regime. Worse, Diem's government was deeply corrupt. Millions of dollars in American aid were misappropriated. The military was bloated with incompetent officers loyal to Diem rather than the people. American advisors on the ground reported that Diem's regime lacked legitimacy and alienated even its own army. But in Washington, policymakers dismissed these concerns. They believed that loyalty to the U.S., not loyalty to the people, was what made a government worth defending. Then came the Buddhist crisis of 1963. When Diem's government banned Buddhist flags during a major religious festival, it sparked mass protests. In response, security forces opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 9. The backlash was immediate and international. Monks began self-immolating in public squares, setting themselves on fire to protest Diem's repression. These images, broadcast around the world, horrified the global public and shocked even American allies. By late 1963, Diem had lost the confidence of his people, his military, and even the Americans who once supported him. U.S. officials secretly gave the green light to a group of South Vietnamese generals to carry out a coup. On November 2, 1963, Diem and his brother Nhu were captured and brutally assassinated. But Diem's removal did not stabilize South Vietnam. It threw it into deeper chaos. A rapid succession of weak, military-led governments followed, each less stable than the last. Civilian support dwindled, military desertions increased, and the Viet Cong grew bolder. The U.S. had hoped that Diem's death would allow a stronger, more democratic government to rise. Instead, it left a power vacuum, and America had to fill it with ever-growing numbers of soldiers. The foundation of the South Vietnamese state was never democratic, never people-powered. It was a paper state, propped up by foreign hands. America had tied itself to a government that could not govern, and it would soon pay the price. By 1964, U.S. involvement in Vietnam was no longer limited to aid and advisors. It was transitioning into a full-scale war. But this escalation did not come through open debate or congressional approval. It came through a carefully crafted deception known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. In August 1964, the U.S. Navy claimed that 2 of its destroyers, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, had been attacked by North Vietnamese boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. The first attack was real, but the second, which became the basis for retaliation, was later revealed to be imaginary, based on sonar misreadings and panic. Nonetheless, President Lyndon B. Johnson used the incident to push through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, granting him sweeping powers to wage war without a formal declaration from Congress. With the stroke of a pen, Johnson began America's largest post-Wartime military engagement. By 1965, over 180,000 U.S. troops were on the ground in Vietnam. That number would rise to more than 500,000 at the peak of the war, but this was no conventional war. There were no clear battle lines, no defined enemies in uniforms. American soldiers found themselves dropped into dense, unfamiliar jungles where every villager could be a friend or a Viet Cong fighter. The U.S. military adopted a strategy of search and destroy, raiding villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, burning homes and calling in airstrikes. But this approach only fueled local resentment. Entire villages were bombed based on suspicion. Civilians were caught in crossfire. American soldiers couldn't distinguish the enemy from the innocent. And the Viet Cong, with superior knowledge of the terrain and local support, struck quickly and disappeared just as fast. In parallel, the U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign over North Vietnam meant to break the will of the communist leadership. But the bombings only hardened Vietnamese resistance. Hanoi dug in deeper, built vast underground tunnels, and funneled troops and weapons south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a complex web of jungle paths that snaked through Laos and Cambodia. The deeper the U.S. got involved, the more it became clear. There was no clear objective. Was the goal to stop the spread of communism, to defend South Vietnam, to destroy the Viet Cong, to win hearts and minds? Each goal conflicted with the others. Military success was measured in body counts, not territory gained or political stability. Troops were ordered to kill as many enemy combatants as possible, creating moral disasters and atrocities. By 1966, the war had become a self-sustaining machine, grinding forward without a clear path to victory. U.S. generals kept promising that the enemy was on the verge of collapse, Politicians assured the public that America was winning. But on the ground, American soldiers were dying, villagers were turning against them, and the Viet Cong were gaining strength. The U.S. had entered Vietnam without understanding the terrain, the enemy, or the culture. It believed that superior firepower would be enough to win, but in a war of hearts, minds, and history, bombs and bullets were never going to be enough. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War was no longer a clash between two militaries. It had devolved into a brutal war against civilians, fought in jungles, rice paddies, and villages. The U.S. military, facing an elusive guerrilla enemy, began to treat entire communities as suspect. The Viet Cong weren't marching in uniform. They blended in with farmers, monks, even children. In response, American forces adopted harsh, sweeping tactics designed not only to destroy fighters, but to deny the enemy any support base at all. This strategy manifested in search and destroy missions, often carried out in rural villages. U.S. troops would sweep through hamlets, torch homes, shoot suspected collaborators, and call in napalm and airstrikes to level entire areas. In theory, this was counterinsurgency. In reality, it became systematic terror. The infamous use of Agent Orange, a toxic defoliant, devastated vast tracts of jungle, but also poisoned soil, food sources, and generations of Vietnamese children. Cancers, birth defects, and environmental destruction followed in its wake. Rather than break the Vietnamese will to fight, these tactics often galvanized resistance. Every destroyed home, every dead family member became a recruitment poster for the Viet Cong. What the U.S. failed to grasp was that it wasn't just fighting communists, it was fighting a people determined to be free, whatever the cost. North Vietnam framed the war as a continuation of their anti-colonial struggle. To many in the South, especially the poor, the Viet Cong seemed like defenders of their land, while the Americans were foreign occupiers propping up a corrupt elite at Emin. At the same time, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast and complex supply network running through Laos and Cambodia, allowed North Vietnam to funnel troops and weapons into the south. Despite years of bombing, the trail remained operational. U.S. efforts to shut it down often spilled the war into Laos and Cambodia, widening the conflict and creating new humanitarian disasters. The moral catastrophe of the war came to a head in 1968 with the My Lai massacre. In the village of My Lai, a U.S. Army unit murdered over 500 unarmed civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. The attack was covered up by military leadership for over a year. When it finally came to light, it shocked the world. For many Americans, My Lai wasn't an anomaly. It was a symbol of how far the war had drifted from any sense of justice or morality. By now, the war was no longer just unwinnable. It had become indefensible. The U.S. was fighting not for democracy, but to preserve the illusion of credibility. It was spending blood and treasure to sustain a lie. While American leaders insisted that progress was being made in Vietnam, a very different battle was brewing back home. The war that began with flags and speeches was now igniting protests, disillusionment, and rage. College campuses erupted in demonstrations. Draft cards were burned. Parents watched television broadcasts of body bags coming home, wondering why. Their sons were dying in a jungle on the other side of the world. The war's tipping point came in January 1968, with the Tet Offensive. During the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese launched a massive surprise attack on over 100 towns and cities across South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Though U.S. forces eventually repelled the offensive, Tet was a psychological catastrophe. It shattered the narrative that the enemy was on the brink of defeat. For the American public, Tet proved that military leaders and politicians had been lying. If the enemy could launch such a coordinated attack after years of bombings and 500,000 American troops, then victory was a myth. The fallout was swift. Public approval for the war plummeted. Journalists turned against the military narrative. The most trusted newsman in America, Walter Cronkite, famously declared after visiting Vietnam, "We are mired in stalemate." President Lyndon B. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Anti-war protests intensified. The draft system, which disproportionately targeted working-class and black Americans, became a symbol of injustice. The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago exploded in riots as police clashed with demonstrators. Prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. denounced the war as morally wrong and economically destructive to the poor. The country itself seemed to be unraveling. Within the military, morale eroded. Drug use, desertion, and fragging, soldiers killing their own officers, rose. Soldiers began to question not just the mission but their survival. Veterans returned home not to parades, but to silence, shame, and trauma. PTSD was widespread but poorly understood. Many felt betrayed, not just by their government, but by a nation that asked for everything, then gave nothing in return. As public pressure mounted, President Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968. His political career, once defined by his ambitious Great Society programs, was destroyed by the war he escalated. The war had come full circle. It had started with the belief that America had to stop communism to save democracy. But by 1968, the U.S. was tearing itself apart, not because of foreign enemies, but because of the lies, violence, and moral failures of its own leaders. By the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War had become a political burden too heavy for the American government to bear. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, promised a way out. His campaign slogan, "Peace with Honor," was designed to reassure Americans that the U.S. would exit Vietnam not in disgrace, but with dignity. But Nixon's strategy masked a painful truth. The war was already lost, and now it was about managing the optics of retreat. Nixon introduced a policy called Vietnamization, which aimed to train and equip the South Vietnamese military to take over combat responsibilities while gradually withdrawing American troops. On paper, it sounded like a pragmatic exit. But in practice, South Vietnam's military remained undertrained, poorly led, and deeply dependent on U.S. air power and logistics. The same time, Nixon secretly escalated the war beyond Vietnam's borders. He authorized massive bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and pressure North Vietnam into negotiations. These bombings, conducted without congressional approval, killed tens of thousands of civilians and destabilized entire regions, eventually contributing to the rise of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, one of the most genocidal regimes in modern history. In 1970, the U.S. expanded the war into Cambodia with a ground invasion, sparking new waves of outrage back home. The most tragic symbol of this domestic unrest was the Kent State Massacre, where National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters, killing 4. The war was no longer just killing Vietnamese. It was now claiming American lives on American soil. Despite these escalations, Nixon finally opened peace talks in Paris. After years of stalling in 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, U.S. troop withdrawal, and the release of prisoners of war. But it did not ensure the survival of South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese had agreed to the ceasefire tactically, knowing full well that once U.S. forces left, they could resume their advance unopposed. In 1975, just 2 years after the U.S. withdrawal, Saigon fell. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the capital's gates, and helicopters evacuated the last Americans from the rooftop of the U.S. Embassy. The image of desperate South Vietnamese clinging to departing aircraft became a lasting symbol of betrayal and failure. The war was over. North and South were reunified under communist control. Exactly the outcome America had spent 2 decades and 58,000 American lives trying to prevent. The U.S. left Vietnam not with honor, but with haunting silence. It had poured billions into a war it never understood, and left behind millions of lives shattered. The Vietnam War was not lost on the battlefield. It was doomed from the start because it was built on fundamental misunderstandings and ideological blindness. American leaders mistook a nationalist independence movement for a cog in a global communist conspiracy. They believed that overwhelming firepower and military technology could overcome history, culture, and human will. They backed corrupt regimes that the people despised. They tried to force a Cold War framework onto a civil conflict rooted in colonial trauma. What made the war unwinnable wasn't just guerrilla tactics or jungle terrain. It was the lack of legitimacy at its core. The United States didn't fight for the Vietnamese people. It fought instead of them, often against them. In trying to save South Vietnam, America destroyed it. In trying to defend democracy, it propped up tyranny. And in trying to preserve its own image, it buried the truth. The scars of the Vietnam War still run deep. For Vietnam, it meant reunification, but at a great cost. For the United States, it meant a permanent crisis of trust in government and military leadership. Vietnam became a cautionary tale, a symbol of imperial overreach, moral compromise, and the dangers of fighting wars with no understanding of the people or land involved.